Hello. The events of the last 8 to 9 months have disrupted everyone's routines, and enablement professionals are certainly no exception. This dramatic and sudden shift provided learning opportunities and a blueprint for scaling the enablement function as we continue our pivot to virtual for the foreseeable future. Today, we'll explore some of the challenges, unpack their root causes, and suggest some solutions. Scaling virtual enablement.
Scaling virtual enablement,
Deploying
programs to help sellers succeed.
My name is Sean Pillow, and I'm the Director of Sales Enablement at Granicus. I spent the last 10 years in software as a service across marketing, operations, product, and sales. I've been with Granicus for about 4 years in pre-sales engineering, sales enablement and operations, and of course, as I'm sure you're all well aware, other duties as assigned. So, what makes virtual enablement so challenging? For me, personally, I always like to start by trying to isolate for the variables we need to impact. Maybe it's because I'm an economist and an engineer by training, but that's where I like to start, trying to understand what it is that has led us to the situation in which we find ourselves. And so I think if we start to look at it, there's 5 key challenges, and there's a variable related to each one of them. The first one, obviously, is that it's made that informal peer-to-peer or in-office enablement, what I like to call water cooler workshops, nearly impossible to have, right? Sellers who overhear a colleague dealing with a challenge on the phone can help workshop responses in real time or learn from senior sellers who may be a part of their team. In addition, as enablement professionals, we're used to being in our markets and with our sellers a high percentage of the time. And that inability to do that in the moment coaching in an informal and unstructured way has disappeared. That presents a real challenge. It's also much harder to get a sense and get a pulse of what it is that our sellers are running into out in the world. Second, there's what I like to call the empathy factor. Everyone is now simultaneously trying to balance a variety of work-life responsibilities. And weirdly, it seems that it's more challenging to do so when you're living and working in the same space, especially for so many of us who were not planning to have a home office, as it were. And so understanding that and structuring our enablement programs around that is a key takeaway, but also a key challenge. Third, rather than pursuing what we might think of as exhaustive training events, maximizing the amount of time that we have with our sellers when we do take them out of the field for enablement, we've learned to try to pivot to something that's more extensive, and we'll talk in greater detail about that shortly. Fourth, it's been harder for our sales managers to coach, right? One of the key elements of a sales manager spending so much time in the field and physically with their sellers is that they're able to do coaching. And so when that ability to interact in real time is taken away, it gives them a real challenge. Fifth, finally, maybe most importantly, it's certainly one of the areas that we have felt the most pain, and I'm sure a lot of you are seeing this as well, is that formal peer or group onboarding, what some people might call a boot camp. Typically, when someone or a new cohort of sellers join, there is a tremendous amount of time spent on in-person, formalized onboarding. And the inability to do that because of the inability to be in offices, the inability to travel, the inability to spend 8 hours on Zoom or your virtual tool of choice is really hard. And so we'll unpack some tips on how to overcome some of those challenges later on today. But before we even do that, I think it's really important to start with our enablement fundamentals, because they'll become even more important as we identify how we're going to scale virtual enablement programs, not just now, but in the future. At some point, hopefully, we will go back to spending a tremendous amount of time together. That socialization and that in-person interaction is extremely valuable, whether it's internally or externally meeting with customers. But virtual enablement will continue to be a part of that. So the first fundamental of enablement is leaning on your sales pillars, identifying what are the 3 to 5 most important strategic goals in your go-to-market team. What are the elements of your go-to-market strategy that your CEO would be able to rattle off right off the top of your head? Orient yourself around those, because just like with all of your other enablement activities, they'll become your North Stars, and it will help when we talk about prioritization. The second component, identify your human capital. Who are people on your team, whether it's in your enablement function, whether it's subject matter experts in other business functions, or whether it's senior sellers or senior sales managers who have knowledge that they share informally with their peers that maybe now needs to be documented, formalized, and become part of an enablement program. Who are the people who can help you do that? Who has a vested interest? I'm sure when you talk to people in your professional services organizations, that they would love to help you document and formalize all of that knowledge about the handoff process, because it makes the customer experience better and it makes the lives for their teams better as well. Third, take a hard look at your current state of materials. What exists today, even if something's imperfect? What do you just not have at all that was only knowledge that lived in someone's head? And what is only delivered informally? Start documenting those things. We'll talk a little bit later about the best way to get started on that and some common challenges as well. Fourth, and maybe most importantly, don't be afraid to say no. If something does not impact one of those important strategic goals, those North Stars for your sales team, don't be afraid to say no to it if it's not likely to be a high value activity. And take a hard look at simplicity and documentation versus training on sophistication and complexity. Not everything needs to be solved by training, right? If we think about the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, a majority of information that we're exposed to, we forget very quickly. And so if we train someone on a complicated process, we have to do so repeatedly. Or maybe if it's not a process that they're likely to do on a daily basis, training isn't the answer. Look hard at simply documenting and creating job aids and making them easy for your sellers to access versus conducting long trainings that are quickly forgotten. There's an excellent stat from the Harvard Business Review that close to 90% of training is forgotten if it's not applied to the job within the week after receiving it. And it just makes sense. If something doesn't seem like it's likely to be important to us and thus a part of our daily routine, we're not likely to remember it. So I'd like to suggest a couple of programmatic solutions to overcoming each of these challenges. And I'll talk a little bit about what I've personally learned over the last several months. Your mileage may vary. You might already be doing some of these things, and others of them might seem like an idea out of left field. So our first challenge, how do we replace that informal peer enablement? What I called earlier, those water cooler workshops, where you have two sellers or a seller and maybe a sales manager from a different market team who, while they're waiting for their coffee in the kitchen, are talking about a deal and talking about customer objections, or maybe they're just teaching each other about their respective markets. That type of knowledge sharing is really valuable, but it's also extremely hard to replicate in a virtual setting. So what have we learned? Open up channels, regardless of your asynchronous communications tool of choice. Create cross-market and intra-team channels, whether you're using Slack or Microsoft Teams or something similar. Make it easy for your sellers to chatter as if they were at their desks or at the coffee machine in the office. And that is incredibly valuable again across market teams. One of the things that we've found is that many of our senior sellers and some of our other teams have valuable knowledge that they're sharing informally, and it's hard to capture. And it's hard to solve that with a direct message. This way, it's opened up so that people across teams are able to collaborate in real time on those opportunities as well. Secondly, encourage office hours with cross-functional teams. I mentioned professional services, but perhaps customer success or your engineering and product management teams, or a finance or legal team. Encourage office hours, whether that takes place virtually over Zoom or asynchronously in a Slack channel. It's really helpful to have a designated time where sellers can expect to get questions answered in real time, the way that they might have previously just walked over to someone's desk in the office. That is, again, extremely valuable, but also very difficult to replicate virtually, and helpful to have that dedicated time. And we'll talk a little bit about why some of those things are hard to replicate virtually in a little bit. Third, monitor that informal Q&A that happens in Slack or over email or in team meetings, right? Maybe you were not previously in the habit of attending all of your sales teams meetings for each market, for each team. I highly recommend attending or encouraging a member of your team, if you're lucky enough to have a team. I know many of us are one-person heads of sales enablement. That's certainly a tough job, but try to attend as many of those team meetings and pay attention to all of that chatter that happens in Slack. Those are your next enablement projects. Those questions that your sellers are asking, that's where you're going to source a lot of the projects that we'll talk about later on for enablement. It's extremely valuable. Next, we talked about the empathy factor. Calendar availability doesn't tell the full story, as it may have previously done, right? Many people are dealing with challenges at home that they did not previously anticipate, whether that's something as simple as walking a pet or something as serious as helping a young child get on their geometry Zoom so that they can take part in virtual learning. Trying to account for that information and that demand is really important. So again, just because someone is active on chat does not necessarily mean that they'll be able to respond to you really quickly. That's why I recommend something like that virtual office hour. So, some things that I've personally learned. One, conduct live trainings, always record them, and capture that follow-up in real time. When I say capture follow-up in real time, I immediately open Confluence or Microsoft Word and I start taking notes of questions so that I can identify that follow-up in real time, and then make those documents available to sellers where they can contribute live Q&A. Because again, it's much harder now to handle some of those things. Someone can't just walk into my office and ask me a question. Another recommendation is when conducting those live trainings, record them using Gong or Chorus or another conversational intelligence tool. It will make it much easier to categorize that information and then enable real-time follow-up, especially if those questions that may come up really need to be answered by somebody in the product management team or professional services or finance, etc. Second, if you are going to conduct a live training and make attendance mandatory, try really hard to leverage part of an existing team meeting rather than creating an additional demand on our sellers that's taking away from time that they need to meet other responsibilities or time that they're able to spend with customers. A third suggestion, always make sure that your training is accompanied by a leave behind, whether that's something that's a full playbook that's talking about personas, objections, pricing, common questions that we anticipate, as well as responses, go to market, the steps you need to follow in Salesforce. Or it's something as simple as a job aid. Like I mentioned before, training is not always the answer to every challenge that our sellers are facing. Oftentimes, they need something as simple as a Word document with some Q&A or just screenshots of what it is that they need to do or what a certain element of the product does. And I think you'll be really surprised when you start asking that question, how often the answer is the latter. That something needs to really just be a job aid and maybe a 5-minute component of an existing team meeting, rather than 30 minutes of training on how to follow a process that's immediately forgotten. Because no one wants to go back and watch 30 minutes of training when they could have read through a simple job aid. Third, one of my first mentors and one of my first bosses told me not to let perfection be the enemy of greatness. And we see legendary coach, Mr. Lombardi there, who once said that perfection is not attainable, but if we chase perfection, we can achieve excellence, right? And so what I'd say is, and I talked about this before when I talked about exhaustive versus extensive, go really broad with the topics that you choose for enablement and let your sellers' engagement with them guide you to where you need to double click and create something more detailed. Our job as enablement professionals is highly iterative, right? Training is a journey, it is not a destination. There's not a point at which someone no longer needs upskilling or training. And so as a result, we shouldn't be afraid to move away from those really exhaustive training events that are unwieldy, I would argue impossible, to recreate in a virtual setting. Pursue a highly varied breadth of topics because you can get it out to your sellers much more quickly. And it's much more valuable to the sellers who need it the most, right? The sellers who need the most enablement are those people who are in the middle of the pack for quota attainment. They're looking for the one or two little things that are going to help them get to 100% this year or next year. And in addition to that, those things are much faster to deploy, right? I can get time with a subject matter expert and quickly create a short enablement session with a leave behind or a job aid and get that done in a week or 2 weeks, rather than trying to figure out how I'm going to coordinate 8 hours of training on one single day. Something that we might have done in the past, right? We're going to do everything related to this product in one day, and people from the various teams are going to come in and out. We're going to break for lunch, and we're going to cover everything that needs to be done. That works really well in person because the engagement is just better, but it's really hard to recreate in a virtual way. It also doesn't give you an asset that you can repurpose and reuse in the future the way that a short single topic event becomes. And finally, remember, the way to eat the elephant is one bite at a time. So chipping away at something ultimately does get you to the finished product and enables you to, if there is great engagement with one of those topics or an expression that there's a need to dive into it further, to take that approach. And what I mean by that is think about doing something like situational enablement. If you don't already have a sales enablement platform, I highly recommend adding one to your stack. Even if it's something simple initially, like using SharePoint or Google Drive to organize content for your sellers. It enables you to take all of those existing resources that, again, are there because you created these one bite, single topic enablement sessions and pull them together as something that will be useful to your sellers in a situation. I use the example of COVID-19, but I'm sure that there will be other trends in each of your individual markets and in each of your individual industries where you'll need something highly situational to help your customers and prospects deal with a challenge. And this lets you quickly pull all of those single topic items together into something that's coherent and cohesive for your sellers. As you can see, we use HighSpot, and our sellers are able to see what's trending, what are their colleagues using, what are the most important elements that they need. So remember, the fourth challenge that I mentioned was teaching our managers how to coach. And not just teaching them how to coach, but enabling many of them on how to coach virtually, because they're not walking out of that customer meeting and in the car to the airport getting that coaching, right? It's harder. So empower them to deliver in the moment feedback. I'm personally a big believer in the 1 minute manager philosophy. Giving that feedback, whether it's positive or negative, right away, right when the behavior happens, rather than having to have that coaching conversation a week later or even a few hours later, when it's hard to recreate why something was done, what happened, or what was said. Second, if you're not currently leveraging a conversational intelligence tool, again, I mentioned Gong and Chorus before, seriously consider adding something like that to your stack. It removes the need for your sales managers to participate in a meeting live, and removes that temptation to jump in and do for the seller instead of coaching later on. It also, along the lines of delivering in the moment feedback, will give them the ability to give that feedback, and then the seller can go back and listen and tie the feedback directly to what happened. It's a really powerful coaching tool. Third, I think a lot of times we just assume that our sales managers are the best coaches and that they don't need additional enablement. But that's not true, right? A lot of times, many sales managers have been excellent sellers and they've been promoted into management. And so some of the fundamentals of being a sales manager might need to be taught to them. Take this as an opportunity to double down on enabling your managers. They are your force multipliers. And especially for those of you that are in a one-person enablement team or an extremely small enablement team, they become components of your team and powerful components to help make sure that all the virtual enablement that you're doing sticks, right? They become also sort of the tour guide for your sellers who are trying to navigate all of the enablement that exists. Fourth, dialing and prospecting tools allow managers to coach at the top of the funnel too. Since they're not sitting there and listening to their sellers on the phone, this gives them a way to listen and observe and make coaching part of their process. Again, the feedback is really important to get in the moment. That's one of the things that I think we have really lost and creates a really powerful challenge is the fact that we're not listening to each other on a sales floor, and whether it's peer-to-peer or manager to seller, getting in the moment coaching. So I talked earlier about how to replace formal onboarding, what some people might call boot camp. And a quick hint, it's not 8 hours of screen sharing, right? So we learned a few tips and a few things not to do. First, a consistent and regular schedule is extremely important. It seems maybe trite to mention, but it's important. It helps develop the consistency that would be taking place if you were pulling somebody out of the field and having them in the office, every day for 3 days, right? Second, try to only make your sessions that are part of onboarding sessions that require interaction. If something's going to just be a lecture, try to pull that information from a previous enablement session that you may have done and identify a structured way that your sellers can work through that. Third, pre-work, homework, assessments. These will make sure that your sellers are coming prepared. They are immediately putting into practice the things that they've learned, and you're testing for their comprehension later on, so that you can identify whether or not a seller is struggling or whether or not you need to refine the content that you are presenting. Again, that type of thing is happening real time when you're in person, but it's very hard to replicate virtually. Fourth, breakout exercises within a session serve several important purposes. One, they help the sellers, again, immediately put into practice the content or the knowledge that you're trying to impart during the course of the session. It also recreates the social aspect of that interaction, especially if you have sellers from multiple teams who are being onboarded simultaneously. This will get them working together in real time and learning from each other and helping that seller build that network within the organization. And finally, make sure you plan for social events. When we all get together for formal onboardings, we're of course eating lunch together, we're going for coffee together, maybe we're going out and having dinner together after the day is over. Try to recreate those things as best you can. It's really important for a new seller who's trying to navigate joining an organization full of people that they've never met except virtually, feel more a part of the organization. And that's really important. That morale component can't be understated. A few things not to do. Try not to go over an hour and a half. Our attention spans just aren't that long. A format that I'd recommend is 10 to 15 minutes of content, a 10 to 15 minute exercise, a 10 to 15 minute review, a short break, and then doing the same on another topic at the back end of that session. You can get 2 topics into an hour and a half session. Very effective. Try not to tailor sessions to the people participating. Identify things that would be purposeful follow-ups for an individual or a small group, rather than trying to create a huge number of onboarding tracks. Don't assume a baseline of knowledge. Don't be afraid to start with the basics. And again, pull in those subject matter experts from other departments, the same way you would as part of a formal onboarding. And don't assume that your sellers are ramped once onboarding concludes. The assessments that I mentioned before are really helpful guidepost for the things that you may go out and do in the future. So thank you for joining today. I look forward to hearing from all of you about your ideas and best practices around scaling virtual enablement and how to help teams in the future. And if you want to connect with me to discuss, you've got all of my information there. I hope you enjoy the rest of the content, and I'll talk to you all soon.
That I wanted to jump in and address. I think Tevin asked a question about conversation intelligence tools. I think someone else responded, but Gong and Chorus are the ones that I've evaluated. Although I know Showpad offers some conversational recording and Exec Vision as well. Lawrence, great question. How has COVID changed the way you see working remotely? I have to be honest, I was never a work from home person. I went into the office every day when I wasn't traveling. And not that I didn't like working from home, but I think one of the things we've learned is I have a lot more empathy for our sellers who are remote and who are not in an office, and how disconnected they can feel sometimes from the organization. And so that's been my big perspective, is developing, an additional respect for those people who are, not just on an island, but literally alone sometimes. Sean Foreman asked, are there any new successful habits or techniques you found in this new remote environment that you'd bring back into daily office life? Yes, absolutely. The big thing is meetings should either be 15 minutes or 45 minutes, but 30 minutes or an hour just doesn't work. Accounting for all of the different things that we might need to do remotely are really helpful. But the other point, and it seems like Tevin might agree with me, is that any type of enablement sessions that are lasting close to an hour, you end up with too much lecture, too much talking, not enough interaction, and not enough resonance of the information after the fact. And that would be one of my big takeaways, is trying to run more purposeful meetings and being more respectful and conscious of everyone else's time. What or how do you do live role play practice? That is a really tough thing to resolve. So I've seen two ways be really effective. In a small team, just randomly pair up two sellers and have them walk through a role play, and then source coaching from the group after the fact. Another way I've seen it done is recording actual customer interactions. So, one thing I think that's really interesting is take a look at your customers that are not really in your ideal customer profile, but people that you'd still want to reach out to, and have newer reps, newer sellers, just start making calls to those people and getting coaching after the fact from their peers. Again, really helpful to have a tool like a conversational intelligence tool like Gong or Chorus to be able to do that asynchronously rather than having to have someone else on the line in real time. Any other questions that anyone has? Feel free to pop them into the chat there, and we can start taking a look at those. How do you deal with fear on your sales team? That is a really interesting challenge to solve. One of the things that we've done is, like I said, encourage our sellers to just start reaching out to people that are at the bottom of our ideal customer profile, just so that they get more comfortable talking to a new persona, right? For us, we work with government, but again, when you have a newer seller, they're changing industries, perhaps maybe they're changing personas that they're talking to. Just getting more repetitions will help them eliminate that fear, and then obviously giving them support. So making sure that they have someone riding along with them, oftentimes who isn't their direct manager. So I really like having sales engineers join initial conversations with newer sellers so that they can model for them what good discovery looks like. And because they are really well positioned to understand the value of the solutions that you're selling, they can help with that. Also, having some other experienced sellers or a sales manager from another team accompany them on some sales calls will help them deal with that fear. Just feeling like they have a safety net if they need it. That's a great question, Lisa. Gabriella asked, I may have missed this, but what is your measure of success? Yes. So a couple of things, right? One measure of success is, how much did we impact those things that we've identified as being critical pillars for our sales organization. Maybe you have a goal to increase sales of a new product. So, trying to measure what role enablement played in that. But then some of the other measures of success that I'd suggest are amount of time it takes a seller to be fully ramped, and achieving 100% of their quota may not be a good metric all the time for saying that someone is ramped. So I'd look at things like achieving 75% of your quota might indicate that a seller is ramped by a given quarter. And then other metrics such as pipeline generation, time to second deal, etc. Anne Marie asked, how do you leverage outside in/external customers' perspective? Where do you spend most of your time? Typical day, week split. Yeah, so I probably spend about 30% of my time interacting with customers, and about 70% of my time interacting internally with our sales organization. My background is as a sales engineer, so I like to dust off that hat every now and then, but also just want to see interaction with customers, both to help with coaching and enablement, but also making sure that we're getting that perspective from the field. We're very fortunate that we work directly with government organizations, and so their circumstances are always changing, their focal points are always changing. So making sure that we're representing that is key as well. That's another area where Gong has been helpful for us, is making sure that we're able to show newer sellers that perspective. How do you encourage people to invest in their own learning without waiting for the company to organize everything? Giving them a lot of options is, and I apologize, I'm getting a call. Giving them a lot of options and serving things up to them and reducing the barriers for them to access it has been really helpful for us. So we use a sales enablement tool. I think I mentioned during my presentation, we use HighSpot. So one of the very first things that we make sure that our sellers do is get an introduction to HighSpot early and get an introduction to all the content that is out there. And I would say that's oftentimes a hiring challenge, right? If you're hiring somebody who is self-actualized and who's highly motivated, just reducing the barriers for them to get that enablement content, a lot of times makes it so that they'll go out and consume that on their own. Any other questions? All right. Well, great chatting with all of you, and feel free to connect with me. I think my email and my LinkedIn are in there. I'd be more than happy to chat with any of you all. Have a great day.